Rangers fans, welcome to Liberty Blue, the essential New York Rangers podcast. I'm Andrew Chelney. That's Nick Zararis. And Nick, the Rangers got their man. Mike Sullivan will be the next head coach of the New York Rangers.
So there's two ways this can go. This is either happily ever after, or this is the couple that we're seeing other people. They started back channeling to each other. Hey, do you want to try and do this? We've been talking about doing this for years, and there's no time like the present. You know, we're both getting close to 30. We're going to figure out what the rest of our lives are going to look like. And I know I love you and I want to try and do this. And it's one of those two things. So it either ends in abject disaster or this ends in happily ever after, because that's the threshold that's been established here. The expectation is they need to win a championship. Otherwise, why did we spend 4 years in a rebuild and then fire the guys who orchestrated the rebuild, let them conduct another rebuild and run a successful rebuild a second time, only to end up back at the starting point of a roster of a bunch of guys in their late 20s and early 30s? That's pretty good, but probably isn't Stanley Cup good. As far as Mike Sullivan himself, we'll see. I think there's definitely a conversation to be had as far as the lifespan of NHL coaches, in the respect that we typically see the coach in their first or second year in a place end up winning something, as opposed to like the 9th or 10th year and breaking through. So maybe that new coach juice works for the first 2 or 3 seasons of a long tenure. But make no mistake, the Rangers are putting up what is probably the richest contract ever given to a hockey coach. They are doing it on the premise of him coaxing more out of the guys they have. And the problem with that is, and I was talking with Jesse Marshall about this yesterday, the Rangers don't really have guys who play the way Mike Sullivan likes to play hockey. They don't have tenacious forecheckers. Like, yeah, sure, you like Brett Berard. That's great. That's one guy.
Will Cooley as well.
Will Cooley, that's 2. I'll give you 2. But Cooley's not like straight line speed in the same way that what made the Penguins so effective when they won back-to-back Stanley Cups was they were just menaces on the forecheck, and they had enough depth where they could play Phil Kessel on the third line, and it wasn't an issue. You also had Jake Gensel and Brian Rust and Patrick Hornquist and Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. Never heard of them. It helps when you have good players to execute what your vision is. And then you saw the last few years in Pittsburgh where the roster wasn't atrocious, but they weren't able to play the way Mike Sullivan wanted them to. He wasn't really willing to adjust what they were doing to make up for the fact that they've lost a lot of foot speed. And don't get me wrong, a lot of misfires in the front office, the Tristan Jarry extension, Ryan Graves' contract as a free agent. But I'm definitely a little more worried about this than I would have been if we had done this 4 years ago, which is what purportedly Chris Drury wanted to do. You know, 4 years ago, it's a different conversation. The Penguins had made the playoffs for pretty much, I think, every year of Sullivan's tenure up till 2021. And now it's been kind of a slog where he hasn't been able to get more out of the guys he's had. So he's a good coach, but a good coach alone does not fix the Rangers' issues.
So I think we should step back a second and look at, okay, the Rangers fired their head coach. They needed a new one. And Mike Sullivan, for all intents and purposes, was the best one on the market.
Yes.
So, you know, like anybody else essentially would have been a disaster on multiple fronts, only because like the Chris Drury, it's not. This is an open secret that he's wanted Mike Sullivan to coach this team for, you know, since day one of his tenure as GM of the Rangers. So if he didn't get Mike Sullivan this time around when he was actually available, that would have, you know, the house of cards would have fallen completely, and everything would have went off the rails in terms of what the vision of the team either should have been or he wanted it to look like, etc. He got his man. And by all accounts, Mike Sullivan, you know, is on, in terms of the free agency list, probably the best name out there. If you want to argue David Carl, you can have that conversation. But Mike Sullivan has, you know, won multiple Stanley Cups, and David Carl has not. Also, we talked about David Carl, you know, in episodes before, where, you know, your first job as an NHL head coach, stepping into this Rangers job is going to be very difficult. And if you don't succeed, how does that bode for your future in the NHL when you won all these things prior, and then you get to the NHL and you struggle, and all of a sudden it's, oh, this guy can't coach the NHL. So, you know, Mike Sullivan is the best head coach on the market. The Rangers got him. And that, you know, they could have gotten Claude Julien or somebody that just is completely
who I didn't realize was a St. Louis Blues assistant coach until last night, and I saw him on the bench in the background as the lead was evaporating.
He was, like they could have went the Peter Laviolette route of an uninspiring name that has been in the league for 75 years, that has never, that is the last time they won or were in the finals was when TV was in 480p. But they did not do that. Thankfully, Mike Sullivan was somebody that Drury really wanted. He got him great. I think the question that you have to ask, and using context clues here, there's been a numerous leaks around Pittsburgh the last few years that Mike Sullivan not constantly, but he wants input on the roster. He wants players that play the way that he wants, and therefore he wants a say in what kind of players the team gets. And from everything that we've heard publicly and, through reports from The Athletic and whatever, that there was a little bit of tension but between Dubas and Sullivan as a result of that. Like, Dubas didn't want to do that all the time. And Mike Sullivan was like, okay, well, if you're not going to do that, then I can't coach this team.
Well, they had different priorities, because that's the thing. Because Sullivan, he looks at the roster and says, we have Crosby, Malkin, Letang, Carlson. We should be trying to be competitive. Like, he very clearly didn't want them to trade Jake Gensel last year. He wanted them to stay in the mix and keep pushing because they are competitive. I was talking with Jesse, and he had said there was a bit of conjecture that Mike Sullivan probably wanted them to take a run at Mitch Marner this summer as a means of being competitive, because he still has 2-3 years of the core of that team. And he's in the prime of his life as far as coaching goes. He's in his late 40s, early 50s. You probably got another 10 to 15 years as a head coach. You don't want to waste 3 or 4 of them retooling on the edges and playing guys like Kevin Hayes and Matt Nieto 13, 14 minutes a night to fill out the bottom half of your roster, because the general manager wants to play ping pong luck, because that's effectively what you're hoping for if you're Pittsburgh, is that you pull a Gavin McKenna out of your ass, or you pull whoever the next first round pick is next year, hopefully not with the Rangers pick next year, but alas, that's the conundrum. And now the attention turns to, is the GM actually going to do roster surgery, or is he going to talk about doing roster surgery? Because lest we forget, 2 years ago, after they lost in 7 to the Devils, not so subtly leaked out there, well, they would trade Panarin if they could. Then you look at the way this season went, where Trouba, Kreider get their names out there. Reportedly, they had asked Zibanejad about being traded, and he said no by virtue of his no trade clause. And now we sit here. It is early May. The Rangers don't have roster decisions to make in that respect yet. They are locking up free agents. We can discuss the merits of giving Parson more than a qualifying offer for a guy who played a third of the final 30 games once he was on the team. But until, one of that Zibanejad, Kreider, Trocheck, Panarin, and I guess JT Miller, but they're obviously not moving JT Miller. Right. Someone in that cohort gets moved to create space to get younger and cheaper. I have a hard time being particularly excited about the direction of the team, because that's the issue. We've known this for 4 years now, that you have built the team around really, really good second line players. If Zibanejad, Kreider was your second line, and you had, a Jonathan Toews and an Evgeny Malkin, a Sidney Crosby led first line, maybe we could talk about winning a Stanley Cup. But JT Miller's not in that ballpark. As good as JT Miller is, and don't get me wrong, he's one of the best power forwards in hockey, he's not dynamic enough. He's not on that Barkov, McDavid, Draisaitl, Eichel tier of player. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's kind of the benchmark here. The worst first-line center in the last 10 years to win the Stanley Cup is Ryan O'Reilly, and Ryan O'Reilly's a good player. That's probably your closest comp, and you have to remember that Blues team had an elite defense and really good forward depth to be able to make up for the fact their best center was Ryan O'Reilly. So the Rangers have a lot of work to go, a lot of work still to do. And it makes the next month or so really interesting in that respect, because they could trade RFA rights. They could try and acquire RFA rights. There are definitely a lot of moving parts to keep tabs on. Cooley extension, Keandre Miller extension, also possibly at some point in the next month or so. There's a lot to keep in mind, even though the Rangers aren't actually probably doing anything of that much significance until June.
The Parson and stuff, listen, with the cap going up the way that it is, I would, he could be the 1 seed in Hartford and be like the 13th forward. That's fine. Like, I'm not too pressed about it. it's not really a big issue to me, at least in my opinion. But going back to Mike Sullivan, it's one of those things where again, Mike Sullivan wants input on the roster, and because Drury and Mike are such close friends, and Mike, for better or for worse, scratched Kyle Connor to play a broken Chris Kreider in the Four Nations tournament. I would have to imagine that one of the reasons Mike took this job, on top of reportedly the highest salary for a head coach in NHL history ever for 5 years, was that, hey, I'm going to have a seat at the table for a lot of these big conversations.
And that's in like direct contrast with everything we know about what Chris Drury wants from his coach.
Well, yeah, which I think he's going to make an exception because it's Mike Sullivan. I think, we go back to when he first hired Gerard Gallant. And the conversation then was, oh, it's not Mike Sullivan. This was his plan B. Oh, Peter Laviolette is not Mike Sullivan. He is the plan B. And now Mike is here. So I'm interested to see how that dynamic changes, because his friend, I guess, like, I don't even, his friend, like his, number one option, his number one, head coach that he wanted to hire for this team is now here. And I'm interested to see how, we know that Chris Drury doesn't tell anybody anything, and he's very secretive, and he keeps an extremely small circle. But now that his number one guy, who he has been hunting for since he got here, is finally a part of this organization, I do wonder if he expands his circle a little bit and includes Mike and whoever else in those conversations. It might not be in all of them, but I would have to imagine that, okay, Mike is going to present a list of, hey, I want X, Y, and Z players. I want, maybe try to get, this player, or, these players with these traits, and go from there. And maybe Drury, does what he does by himself, or maybe he does include Mike, who knows. But I think Mike will have some kind of input on at least some of the changes in the locker room. That's one of the things he wanted in Pittsburgh, and I would have to think that was a big part of the conversation here as he got hired in New York.
The one last thing on Mike Sullivan before we move on and open up our conversation for today's show. The one thing that more than one Penguins fan told me that we do need to be aware of is that Mike Sullivan loves hockey players who play the way he used to play. And if you're not familiar, Mike Sullivan was one of the grindiest grinders to ever grind. So the premise of adding guys like Berard, Cooley, I guess by extension Edstrom and Rempey, that's probably the best outcome, is that they're young and cheap, as opposed to what the Rangers have done in the past, where they pay for like the boutique grinder, which is usually someone who isn't actually that good and is more of a fighter. Like, as soon as they actually have to start paying people like Rempey and Edstrom real money, and like, as you said, the cap going up is going to make that more bearable. They aren't guys who are going to have a ton of leverage, who probably aren't going to be in the market for an offer sheet.
They're going to be like, they're probably going to look at
between 1 and 2
and money.
Yeah,
I mean,
1 and 2.
with the cap going up the way that it is, it's fine. I'm just not thinking about
the one thing I will
those
say,
kinds of contracts anymore, just because of how high the cap is going and will continue to go.
The one thing I will say about that, it's not so much the money they gave Parsonen. It's the fact that 3 weeks ago, we assumed he was going to be non-tendered because how little they used him down the stretch. And my supposition is that Laviolette and Drury just weren't on speaking terms for the last month of the regular season, because the lineup decisions just don't reflect what the general manager seems to have envisioned for the guys he acquired. Like, if Parsonen's 24, 25 years old, I think less than 150 career NHL games, they had like a 5% chance of making the playoffs. Why did he only play 11 of the final 31 games if he's going to be on the team next year? That's the critique there. And again, people say, well, the GM doesn't set the lineup card. Well, guys, I don't know if you know this or not, but the coach serves at the leisure of the general manager. It's like being in the cabinet, where if the president tells you to do something and you refuse, the president asks for your resignation. That's how this works.
Kyle Connor got scratched for Chris Kreider, and you're telling me that Drury didn't have a say in that?
That's what you are putting. That's why you have to think about this in more than just sports terms. Because when you start to extrapolate these things out as just like rational decisions, why did they let a guy who wasn't going to be on the team manage the team for a month and a half? Like, obviously they had Mike Sullivan in mind, so they wanted to wait till the end of the year. We couldn't get 15 games of Dan Muse or Michael Pekka coaching the team to maybe give guys like Perreault and Osman some run, to maybe give them a head start for what training camp will be in the fall. But that's neither here nor there. The season is over. Thank God. That was one of the most miserable experiences of our entire lives.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
There's an idea going around, and I don't hate this idea of, Dan Muse continues to be on the coaching staff while Michael Pekka goes to coach Hartford. And I like that idea. I think again, I don't know why the Rangers kind of held on to Laviolette and just not have Pekka coach for 20 games just to see if he can do it. I think like part of the worry there, if your jury is, okay, well, if he's like really good at it, other teams are going to want him. Mm-hmm. And then he's going to leave because you want Mike Sullivan. And now like it's kind of a Sophie's choice in a way, but it's like, oh, I don't want Mike Pekka to coach this team because if he's really good, Mike Sullivan's going to be available, and now I'm going to have a conundrum as to what I do. But like now that he didn't do that, it's like, oh well, we don't know, so we're just going to hire Mike Sullivan.
The one last thing on that, and it's tied to that. I was reading, I forget whose feature it was, but it was about Marty St. Louis before the Habs got eliminated last week. And I didn't know this, that apparently after he retired in 2015, that Jeff Gorton was like, we want you to coach Hartford, as like a 37-year-old who just retired and was freshly in the playoffs. And ultimately, he didn't end up doing that. Obviously, he went back to living in Eastern Connecticut, I think, is where St. Louis ended up settling, was coaching his kids' hockey team when he got the Habs job. And there's the alternate universe where the Rangers still have Jeff Gorton running the show and Marty St. Louis is the coach of the Rangers right now. And they're like they're basically where Montreal is right now, where they really slow played the rebuild until they were absolutely ready. And then they started pushing chips in. And I know there's I wouldn't say a majority, I'd say a plurality of people out there who very much are sour on that whole rebuilding window now, because all the Rangers have to show for it are K'Andre Miller, Alexis Lafreniere, and Braden Schneider. Why did we suck for 4 years to get a third pair defenseman, maybe a second pair defenseman, and a middle six forward? Just not a great return on investment. But you know what wasn't miserable, Andrew? The first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs was actually really fun. So
much fun.
All-time great game sevens. Some really fun series like Vegas, Minnesota was really fun. Minnesota's young guys, Kaprizov and Boldy, were great in that series. Even Montreal played Washington pretty tough. Like the only series in the first round that was genuinely a stinker was Carolina and the Devils. And you kind of expected that because the Devils are missing so many important players and half their defense got injured during the course of that series. So the conversation for today's show and the way I like to think about the playoffs is kind of like conducting an experiment. You know, you have your scientific theory, your steps along the way, and you conduct the experiment, you draw conclusions, and you move on from that. That's the way you should be thinking about the playoffs, is trying to apply concepts and ideas to your team. And obviously, it's not a direct one-to-one because every team is different and the environment and all of the situational context that goes in. But starting with that Washington-Montreal series, because that series wrapped up pretty quickly, the big takeaway I had, number one, it's not that hard to retool if you are willing to take chances.
Yeah.
You think about the guys Washington decided to bet on, you know, some late first round picks, guys like Connor McMichael and Alexei Protas that were picked in the 20s. You think about betting on Dylan Strome as a non-tendered RFA from the Blackhawks at that point. You think about swinging the Kemper for PLD trade, which worked out very well for both parties. And if you are willing to gamble on low risk things, but PLD is not really low risk because they are tied into him for another 6 years.
At the time he was.
They're still tied into him for 6 years. That's why it's not really low risk.
Yeah,
but
I think there was a big risk given like what happened
Yeah.
with BLD, the last couple of stops that he had both in
all
Winnipeg
three.
and in
All three.
yeah,
And drafted in Columbus, in Winnipeg, and in LA. Yeah.
There was a lot of conjecture of like both sides weren't happy with that deal at the time. If you remember, like Washington was like, "Yo, this guy just got essentially like kicked out the door the last 3 stops he was here," and LA was like, they traded PLD for who? And now all of a sudden, like it all works out. But at the time, that trade, everybody like couldn't believe what was going on almost.
A very weird one for one that ended up working out very well for both parties. And then on the Montreal end of things, just giving your guys experience. That's the most valuable thing Montreal got out of that. They played okay. They lost really badly in their 5-on-5 minutes, but their power play was great and kept them alive in that series.
By the way, that sounds a lot like a team we know.
Hey, I don't know if Nick Suzuki is ever going to be good enough to be the engine of a Stanley Cup winning team. I definitely think he could be the second line center on a Stanley Cup winning team. He was great in that series. Caulfield continues to take strides. I hope he gets to play for Team USA in the Olympics next year. I think we have put to bed the idea of needing the New York contingent of Kreider, Brock Nelson, and Vincent Trocheck in that type of environment, just because they didn't play a lot in the Four Nations. And if you're only going to play a guy 11 minutes, wouldn't you rather have the guy who can shoot 18% from the field as opposed to someone who's just going to clog and take up space? But those are my major takeaways from that series, because both those teams, they're not really Stanley Cup caliber. Like Washington will have a chance against Carolina, but even if they do, I don't think they get past Florida. But being willing to take chances is really the takeaway. And I know we've gotten on Drury a lot for that over the last few years, because the swings haven't really been creative. It's been adding to what's here and refusing to change what's here. Trading out Ryan Strome for Vincent Trocheck, it's like a 10% improvement, a 15% improvement. Like, yeah, objectively, Trocheck's a better player, but you needed to take some swings, and you waited 4 years, and now apparently we're finally going to take some swings.
You would have loved to see the swings 2 years ago. Yeah. They were going, had a really good chance at winning the Stanley Cup, and then you chose to not fill the holes that they needed to fill. So, but you swung the year prior to that by getting Patrick Kane and Tarasenko and all these guys, and you bounced in the first round because you didn't fill the needs that you needed to fill. Are you seeing a pattern here? But it's Washington saw what was going on around them. The joke at the time was, okay, you're going to extend Wilson to this lifetime deal. You're going to give Ovechkin this lifetime deal, and this is going to be the post Stanley Cup retirement home for those guys. You're going to push the goal record to as far as it could go, because Ovechkin has given you a Stanley Cup, so it's going to be Ovi and friends. He's going to just do nothing but shoot the puck and score, and that's going to be that. And the Caps didn't want to do that. They looked around and said, okay, so this is the narrative that this is how other teams and fans and executives see us. We don't really want to do that. So we're going to get creative and find solutions to problems that require, more than just surface level thinking. Right, like everybody knew Jacob Chikrin was good and Dylan Strome was good and these things, but it takes a good general manager to look around and be like, okay, these guys are good, but we can acquire those guys. Also, we can see how we feel about.
It didn't even cost a lot to get Chikrin either.
No, it did not.
Go back and watch the episodes before the Devil series, and instead of talking about forwards, Andrew and I are just screaming, "Please trade for Jacob Chikrin! Please trade for Jacob Chikrin!" Because they've needed defensemen for 3 years.
Really strange. Yes,
they've needed a defenseman since 2022. Like after that Tampa Bay series, instead of running back the exact same 6 defensemen, but putting a Zach Jones in that spot or Ben Harper in the Patrick Nemeth spot, go out and get a real 6th defenseman. And they did the year after. They got Gustafsson, who was a great 1-year, $850K contract. But moving along to the next series, as far as Carolina, New Jersey, I think New Jersey
sources say that they called Ottawa. We're going to include light bulbs in this deal, and then Ottawa said no. So that's beside the point.
As far as New Jersey, I think New Jersey's now at the point where they themselves need to kind of reconfigure who they're building this team around to some degree, because they've had 2 playoff runs, and both times they've run into Carolina, who just objectively plays a difficult style for the Devils to cope with. And I think as the Devils integrate Nemitz and maybe a Seamus Casey into their back end, it'll get a little bit easier for them. But they kind of feel like they need to shake something up. And I don't know necessarily how I would apply that logic to the Rangers, but very clearly that group needs something else they don't currently have. Like
Seamus Casey, by the way, the most Scottish name of all time.
It's a great name. Seamus Casey, and he's good too, which he will eventually be a guy. And the Devils are now in a point where they have got the core of their team pretty much locked up. You have Brett, you have Hughes, you have Heischer, you have Little Hughes, you have Nemitz. Dougie's getting up there, but he's still useful. You have Timo Meier, and now you just need to figure out what you want to do. Do you need to go all in on more Andre Palat, veteran experience types to kind of round out the bottom half of your lineup? Do you need to do a 1-for-1? Do you need to try and turn Jesper Bratt into something else? Do you need to try and turn Timo Meier into something else? Because they have shown the ability to be a good regular season team, but as we can attest, being a good regular season team does not necessarily correlate to being a good playoff team.
I think it's really difficult to kind of gauge what the Devils are going to do.
Especially because health.
Or what they think they should do, because this last month has kind of been a wash. As much as they would have loved to see what this roster could do while healthy, they were not given that opportunity. And so, like, those types of finishes are the worst because you don't know what to do. Like, if you had a roster and they showed you what they were, the decisions become a lot easier. Like, the Rangers this season, you take a look and you go, okay, like, it's very obvious to see what went wrong. With the Devils, it's like
injuries, and that's really the thing.
Injuries,
because Markstrom missed 3 months. Hughes missed basically the whole second half of the season. Right. Dougie missed 3-4 months. It's hard to account for that.
There's so many things that went wrong in the playoffs, and most of them are just health wise, which aren't personnel based. They're mostly luck based. Like, they're mostly just you took a bad hit or you took a puck at a spot that like bounced a certain way, and injuries happen all the time. But the thing about the Devils team is that, I don't want to say they lost because of the injuries, but we didn't get to see what the Devils could have looked like if they had a healthy roster. The healthy roster is a lot more dangerous than the roster they put out on the ice. So if you're the Devils and you're looking around, you're going, okay, well, what do we change? What do we fix? It's a more difficult question than, people want to admit or think about, because it's like, well, we didn't lose because of the roster. We lost because our best players weren't playing.
Yeah. And then as for Carolina, I reserve judgment on Carolina because at this point, if they don't make at least the conference finals, it's hard for me to really gauge anything. We know the Hurricanes are a really good regular season team. We know that Rod Brind'Amour gets really good results in the regular season, and they can beat the teams they're supposed to. That's kind of been their MO in the postseason, that they can usually win their first round matchup, whether it's been the Islanders, whether it's been the Devils, whether it's been Washington in years past. They can beat the teams they're supposed to. Aho looked pretty good. You need more out of Svechnikov. Stankoven fits what they want to do, but it feels like that's a team that without that blue chip A1 guy is going to have a harder time the longer they go in the playoffs. Because we know trying to win with depth and defense, the further you go in the playoffs, it becomes harder and harder because the quality of competition goes up with each round. I expect them to beat Washington. I wouldn't be surprised if the Capitals won. But as far as applications of logic, I will say Carolina's ability to just integrate guys into whatever they do, no matter when they acquire them, is pretty impressive. The fact that they can consistently turn over their defense and integrate new pieces, and they fit pretty well, it is a testament to running a strong system and really having an identity rooted in the coach. It does have its limitations, but it turns out consistent regular season results. And for a franchise like Carolina, where they are in the pecking order of the ecosystem, That's really valuable. I don't know how well that would apply to what the Rangers are trying to do. If Rod Brind'Amour had them playing Corsi hockey like this, I don't know how necessarily that would correlate to more or less success. But I do think there is something for buying into what your coach is selling, and that's something the Rangers desperately need to do going forward.
Well, they haven't really done that in the past few years. They bought into Laviolette's system in the first year, and then that kind of imploded so dramatically this past year that we are now talking about a new head coach within the Rangers organization. So I would have to think that the Rangers are going to buy into Mike Sullivan's system now. And like at this point, if they don't, then they have. I would think that Drury will show them the door one way or the other. Mostly because again, Mike Sullivan is Chris Drury's friend, and if you don't listen to my friend, then you shall not be in the conversation anymore. Which at this, like, you know, for a lot of like this could be a lot worse. Like if Drury was friends with Pete Chiarelli, or like, you know, if Drury was friends with David Quinn, like, and David Quinn got the head coaching job or whatever, or like if Peter Chiarelli became, you know, the president of this team and started making all the decisions, like then it'd be like then it would be panic mode. But at least Mike Sullivan is, you know, one of the best head coaches in hockey. So there's worse people to be friends with. So I would think that if the Rangers were to buy into a system, it would be Mike Sullivan's system. So at least from that perspective, I do think the Rangers are on the right track.
Moving along to Florida-Tampa Bay, winning the Stanley Cup gives you confidence is my takeaway, because that series, Tampa Bay's power play and just not being able to get going at all was the difference. They went 1 for 15 in the series. You get a couple power play goals in there, you at least get to a 6th or a 7th game. Tampa Bay was aggressive in retinkering, swapping Stamkos out for Gensel, swapping Sergachev out to get McDonough. They had a conscious idea of how to improve their team. I liked their deadline additions of Gord and Bjorkstrand. I really liked what they did this year. You got a great regular season out of Vasilevsky and McDonough, for that matter. For Tampa Bay, I would argue they got the short end of the stick having to play Florida in the first round. But Tampa Bay definitely needs more depth. That's very clearly the issue. The bottom half of their lineup is just guys, and not guys I could pick out of a lineup. So they need more depth. And as for Florida, I mean,
also please don't trade 5 picks for Tanner Jeannot ever again. Please don't do that. That was one of the worst trades I've ever seen.
It was very weird, to say the least, especially now in hindsight. And then as for Florida, I mean, buzzsaw would be the polite way to put it. They dropped, I mean, Tkachuk hadn't played hockey since February, and he looked fine. If anything, he looked energized that he hadn't played hockey in 2 months. You dropped Marchand in there. You still have Barkov and Reinhart humming along. They've been so good that they've overcome the fact that Carter Verhaeghe had half as many goals this year as he did last year. That is a scary team. I expect them to win the East again. I think they are a clear cut above everyone else that's left in the East.
I had Winnipeg and Florida in the final.
Yeah.
And I was sweating bullets in that game 7 last night watching the Jets. We'll get to that in a minute, but yeah, I didn't see Tampa winning that series. I know I saw so many brackets.
I picked Tampa.
I saw so many brackets of Tampa winning the cup or getting in the final, and I looked at that roster and I said, I can't imagine them doing it with this like like you said, the forward depth was not anything to speak of, and even the blue line depth was like, okay, you know, there's obviously there's good names at the top, but you get to the bottom and you're like, who are these people? And it didn't feel right to me. Vasilevsky obviously could steal a series at any moment, but the Florida just outclassed them. I mean, You watch that series and you go, you know, even Vasilevsky was talking about it, and I understand that the injury list for the Lightning came out and it was incredibly large. Like Hedman was playing with a broken foot or a broken leg or whatever it was, and like, you know, half that team was like hobbling on the ice whenever they were out there. And you know that you have to talk about that when talking about the play of a team, especially in the first round. I mean, they played a really solid Florida team, and the list of injuries was like 10 or 12. I mean, it's a massive list, and that definitely goes into consideration. But at the end of the day, the roster flaws were still there, And now all of a sudden you get these rumors like, oh, John Cooper to Utah because he's friends with the Utah owner. Oh, okay, well, like now because this happened, the domino effect is starting to fall. I'm very interested in seeing what happens with Tampa Bay the next few seasons, especially if this rumor about John Cooper going to Utah is true.
Toronto, Ottawa, interesting series in that Ottawa controlled a good swath of the play at 5-on-5, and Toronto largely won the series on special teams. As far as Toronto, I would say getting the right coach definitely helps. I think Craig Berube has shown he's a better NHL head coach than Sheldon Keefe. I don't think, that's a huge difference between those two. I do think Sheldon Keefe is a good coach. But getting a guy with some winning experience and kind of knowing the buttons to push to coax better performances. And then the other thing I would say as far as Toronto, meeting the moment and understanding the moment, because Ottawa really wanted to make that series into a circus. The constant after the whistle stuff, the Brady Tkachuk stuff, all Ottawa tried to do was turn that series into a rock fight, turn it into a pissing contest. And Toronto very patiently just abstained, let Ottawa take all those penalties. And that was the difference in the series. Like I said, Ottawa controlled play at 5-on-5. They had a better share of the high danger chances and the expected goals. And I will say, Toronto finally, I won't even say finally because the Stolars tandem isn't like incredible, but putting a little more emphasis on your goaltending, definitely a nice difference. And hell, I mean, Toronto traded what they did for Scott Laughton, and he plays like 11 minutes a game. I think that's a strong sign you kind of figured something out. If one of your deadline additions basically is a non-factor and you won your series in 6 games.
I like it. That's the thing too is, you can't tie player output to how much you gave up to get him, especially if it's a player like Scott Laughton, where, you can't force him into playing top line minutes, have him play 22 minutes a game, and then just expect him to fit immediately and as well as he can just because he was the deadline addition. Like, for all of the not great things people have to say about the Maple Leafs, and a lot of it is warranted, I think this was a great decision by Berube to be like, hey, this is a new guy and he's a good player. Well, or at least he was not as great now as he used to be, but like, the thought process of this is a new guy, we're going to bring him in, but we're not just going to shove him into the top 6 and tell him, yeah, go have fun. No, he fills a need that they felt that they needed to fill. And now he's playing 11, 12, 13 minutes, what have you, in that specific role. And again, we've talked about this with Bjork, when the Rangers traded for Bjorkstrand and who was the other guy that they got? I don't even like
Lightning, Johnny Gord.
No, the Rangers.
When? What year?
2 years ago.
Kane, Tarasenko,
No. 2 years ago. It was
Wenberg and Roslovic?
Yes, thank you. Not Bjorkstrand. Yes, Wenberg and Roslovic. Like, you trade for those guys and play them in the middle 6 or bottom 6. You don't trade them to prop them up to play with Kreider and Zibanejad on the top 6, because that's not how they play. Toronto, I don't know if they learned from the Rangers specifically, but like, they made the right decision of, okay, we are acquiring a middle 6, bottom 6 forward. There is absolutely zero reason to play him top 6 minutes. We are going to play him at the role that he is good at. And lo and behold, it's working out. What a surprise.
Shifting gears to talk about the Western Conference, which is undoubtedly better. The top to bottom, the West is a better conference. So we'll start with that Winnipeg-St. Louis series. And number one, the takeaway for me from that series isn't so much about the actual results as much as it is just finding a way and resolve. And sometimes it's not going to be pretty, and sometimes it's going to be as grim as it can possibly be. I don't know if it gets more grim than being on home ice without your number one defenseman, number one center, and your future Hall of Fame goalie giving up 3 goals in the first 10 minutes of the game. I don't know if it can get more grim than that. And you think about how the Rangers answered any adversity this season. You think about that game they played against the Kings that Saturday afternoon where the get-in price was like $230, and they lost 7-0, 6-0, and entirely no-showed. And it's very easy when things are going hard to just pack it in. That was the Rangers' MO this year. But it was nice to watch a team accept some responsibility and say this isn't over. You know, you think about how many times the Rangers pulled the goalie this year for the 6-on-5. They couldn't even score one, let alone two in 3 minutes. And I give a lot of credit to that Winnipeg team. Neil Pionk playing 46 minutes in a game. Just ridiculous superhero type stuff. And sometimes it's not about being the better team. Sometimes it is just about getting lucky.
Yeah, but like, you know, the saying that you make your own luck or whatever. It's the Jets had nothing until they did. And with 3 minutes to go, they were down 2 goals. And I think it was 3-1 with like 3.5 to go when they pulled their goalie. And at that point, all you needed to do was just like if St. Louis had us like a slight window, they didn't even need a big a slight angle towards the empty net from 100 feet away. They would have scored. The series would have been over. The Jets not only gave themselves a chance, they refused to give St. Louis one, and that's the defining factor of this series. Is the Connor Hellebuyck brother, please, I need you to that second goal was like. I hate to say, I don't want to say it was one of the worst goals I've ever seen in my life, but it's up there, dog. It's up there. That was that's the most routine save on the planet. For that to go in the net is abhorrent. But in fairness to Connor Hellebuyck, he remembered he was a goalie after that goal and played really well. So at least it's okay because the Jets won the game. But I would have been really interested in finding out what the discourse would have been in Winnipeg if the Jets had lost that series. And the biggest memory that the Jets fans have had was, oh my God, Connor Hellebuyck in the playoffs is the worst goalie they've ever seen. They didn't do that. The Jets somehow got the second goal. Rangers legend Vladimir Mestikov, of course, getting the second goal, and then 1.6 to go, very reminiscent of that Callahan 6.6 goal from 2012, I want to say, which was 13 years ago, which, oh my God, we are so... I don't even want to talk about that at this point. That was so long ago. But, that is a very one-to-one comparison of teams that just refuse to lose. That Rangers team refused to lose that game. The Winnipeg Jets refused to lose that game. And the Rangers this year had shown zero of that. The Rangers, I think they had 0 multi-goal comebacks until the last game, or the second to last game of the season or whatever. There was 0 of that the entire year. So the Winnipeg showed that, and they refused to lose. And hey, I mean that's why you play to the buzzers. I mean, 1.6 is a lot of time if you could get that shot off, and they did. And I mean they made it happen. It was that game was insane.
The one last thing I'll say on that real quick, it would have been really nice if, and look, they weren't going to do it, but the same thing happened when Boston fired Claude Julien in 2017. I said it at the time. I'll say I said it this year when Boston fired Jim Montgomery. Sometimes the good coach that's just sitting there, you should make the call. Would Jim Montgomery have taken the Rangers job in December or whatever it was when he got fired from Boston? Maybe. I definitely guarantee they wouldn't have gone 5-15 in December if they had Jim Montgomery as the coach. I can say that pretty definitively. So sometimes the in-season coaching thing, and that's not something the Rangers do often. The last time they did that was Tom Renney and Tortorella, and that was 15 years ago at this point, 16 years ago at this point. But if Jim Montgomery's sitting there and you need something to save your season, it was worth the conversation at the very least.
I wonder if the long haul idea was Drury not wanting to do that because he knew Mike Sullivan was going to be available.
That would be the assumption, yeah. That's the assumption.
But again, the counterpoint is, okay, well then watch it. If you're going to do that, you're essentially wasting a season.
That's the thing, yeah. That's definitely been my takeaway. The other crazy game 7, Colorado, Dallas.
Yeah.
Bet on star players. At the end of the day, when you can get a franchise-altering player, you deal with the consequences later. You go through recent NHL history. it's really hard to think of a team that lost a trade acquiring the superstar player. I mean, if you want to make the argument the Penguins lost the Erik Karlsson trade because they haven't done anything since acquiring him, but you look what they gave up. It's not like San Jose got anything of note that was going to help Pittsburgh in the last year and a half. But you think about it, that one, you think about Matthew Tkachuk, you think about Jake Gensel for Carolina last year to some degree. Bet on the superstar, because even if their metrics aren't great, their talent is innate and their talent allows them to outplay their metrics to some degree. And Rantanen's in the prime of his career where you don't have to worry about the decline catching up with those metrics. Bet on star players and figure out the rest later, because you need at least two of them if you want to be a serious Stanley Cup contender. And Dallas has, I would argue, three of them. Two of them are defensemen, which might be an issue later they go in the playoffs. But having a player of Mikko Rantanen's caliber is basically a prerequisite if you want to win the Stanley Cup.
And if we're going to tie that back to the Rangers, it's, okay, well, who on the Rangers can do that? Like, and I understand it's a difficult question because, like, there's, you know, a handful of superstars in the NHL, but Mikko Rantanen single-handedly won that game for the Dallas Stars. I mean, a hat trick, a 4-point third period to go from a 2-0 deficit to a 4-2 win in a Game 7 against your old team. Like, my man's part of the seas for that wraparound goal. Ryan Lindgren looked like a complete circus, like a circus act, and Mikko Rantanen just said, "Okay, you're in the way, but you're not even on balance. Like, I'm just gonna scooch past you real quick," and then darts past him, and then wraps around and went off of I think Sam Girard's leg, and it went in the net. Like, the Rangers don't have that player,
no.
And that's the biggest takeaway for me is, you know, if the Rangers really want to win the Stanley Cup, you know, it's obviously easier said than done. I'm not saying, you know, these people grow on trees and it's easy to make those kinds of trades, but Stanley Cup winners have game changers on their team, and
at least one, if not two or three,
and a forward,
yeah,
that can break the game. Forget the blue line and the goalie for a second. Just watch. You know, Edmonton did it with two forwards and a dream that last season. They made it to Game 7 of the final with McDavid, Draisaitl. I mean, you know, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Don't take what, you know, like this particular, like, too seriously, but like, this was Dry, McDavid, and friends, and it still kind of is. But because Draisaitl and McDavid are so out of this world, insanely good, they are able to win games by themselves and drag everybody else, you know, by themselves. And I understand, you know, in the LA and EDM series, I think McDavid didn't have a point in the last 3 games, or I think Draisaitl didn't either. It's like something like that. Like, you know, I get that, but we're talking grand scheme of things here. McDavid and Draisaitl are able to say, okay, no one else is going to do it. All right, screw it. I'll do it myself, and then go and score 9 goals in a game. Like, they have the ability to do that. And that is what makes them so dangerous at any moment of the game. Whereas with the Rangers, you know, the biggest takeaway for me is 0 of the forwards have that right now. 0. Maybe every now and again, like JT Miller could do it, or, you know, Chris Kreider did it last season against the Hurricanes. But as of, you know, today, early May of 2025, the Rangers don't have a forward that can say, all right, like, you don't want to shoot. You don't want to shoot. You're not going to do this. Okay, well, I'll do it. That's fine. Like, let me, just give me the space. I'll do it myself. There's none of that. And if you want to win the Stanley Cup, you need someone like that.
And it's not just having the physical means to make the play. It's having the resolve to do it. You know, it's taking that personal onus of someone needs to make a play. I will do it. That's kind of the issue. I mean, that's the story of Chris Kreider's career for me, is that he has shown the ability on occasion to outright dominate, to be the best player on the ice for prolonged stretches of time. And he just doesn't do it all of that often for whatever reason. And that's kind of been one of the real sources of frustration for me. Because you said it, when McDavid and Draisaitl are in the suck and they need to make something happen, there is nothing you can do. There is nothing you can do. You can play great layered multi-level defense like the Kings do. You can have an above average, borderline, very good goalie in Darcy Kemper, and they don't care. Those two and Evan Bouchard had 26 points combined through the first 4 games of that series. Ultimately, their depth helped in the final 2 games. You know, you got goals from guys like Corey Perry and Adam Henrique and Connor
Corey
Brown.
Perry goal was insane, by the way.
The Corey Perry jam play, we can tie that into the Rangers too. Sometimes the best play is just parking your ass in front of the net, taking away the goalie's eyes, and being difficult. The Rangers do not have anybody who plays that way. But it's different because Corey Perry actively likes being miserable. Whereas like Chris Kreider's a nice guy. Like he laughs at people when they try and instigate with him after whistles. Corey Perry will cross-check you in the face, break your nose, eat the 2-minute penalty, and that'll be it. You know, he doesn't care. Like the Rangers need a little bit of that maliciousness in their best players. I mean, we talk about that all the time as far as like Kucherov. Like he's one of the best players in the world, and he's a miserable prick. You need a little bit of both if you're going to win, because you need that innate, like we were saying before about McDavid and Draisaitl, the nobody is going to stop me if I need to make this play thing. It's the same thing for someone like Kucherov. And then real quick, from the Kings side of things in that series, don't rest on your laurels. Defense and goaltending are fallible. Eventually, they will break through if you give them 30 straight minutes of unfettered shots on goal. That's a very obvious takeaway the Rangers haven't learned in 15 years.
Henrik Lundqvist is one of the best goalies on the planet. Igor Shesterkin is one of the best goalies on the planet. And I don't know if you know this, Nick, but like the goalies can't score goals.
No.
And eventually, if you make the goalies, no matter how good they are, make 9 high danger saves a game, that's not exactly a winning formula to success here in the NHL in the year 2025. Like the best part of having a great goalie is to give them as little work as possible, because the point is that if your team in front of the goalie is so good that they are preventing the goalie from having to try to make these incredible saves, that then you can count on them for when you need them to make that big save, because they're really good at their job. Like you're paying Shesterkin all this money, and by the way, every penny very deserved, no matter what first name bunch of letters on Twitter wants to tell you. He's the best. You pay for talent. Yeah. You pay him a lot of money because he's the best at what he does. Yeah. That's kind of how the real world works too. So that's not a surprise that Igor's going to make a bunch of money here. But having Shesterkin doesn't mean that you can just ignore playing defense. Having Lundqvist doesn't mean that you can just ignore playing defense. The whole point is, okay, the ideal is, okay, we have the best goalie in the world. Also, we have our defense that's so good that good luck even getting to him. That's the whole point, is you having multi-layered, like a barrier almost. Oh, you broke through the first one? Oh, good luck, because there's 7 more. Oh, you spent 4 games trying to break the first one down? I hate to break it to you, buddy, but we got like 12 more that you're gonna have to break down, and they're all heavier than the last before you get to the pearly gates. Listen, you got you go ahead, you could try, but you only have so much time, and we're scoring 4 goals a game, and you have less than that, and we're winning all these games. Rangers clearly, for the past 15 years or 20 years at this point, have said, okay, we have the best goal in the world. Surely that's all we need for defense, right? That's all we need.
It's a real conundrum, because it's also misguided their evaluations of their defensemen, because they look at the goals against and say, well, we're a good defensive team. I can vividly picture Mike Milbury and Keith Jones saying that on NBCSN intermission reports a decade ago, that the Rangers are a great defensive team. They're always in the top 5 in goals against, as if that's reflective of quality of defense as opposed to quality of goaltending. The last series, Minnesota-Vegas, number one, Minnesota made that a series on their star players playing like it, Matt Boldy and Kirill Kaprizov playing out of their damn minds. And they could have made that series. They could have gotten to a game 7. They got very lucky that goal got disallowed for offsides, and I think that was game 5, and then Vegas closed it out in 6. And then on the Vegas end of things, sometimes just having a good coach makes a difference, man. Bruce Cassidy is undoubtedly one of the 5 best coaches in hockey, and you compare that to John Hines, who has never won a first-round playoff series in like 10 attempts, and you think about what that means and how the Rangers could make a comparison to that as far as, you know, Gallant, Laviolette tier of retread versus the Montgomery and Bruce Cassidy and maybe Mike Sullivan tier of retread, because those are very different things. You know, like, yes, they've all been at previous stops and had success at previous stops, but they're clearly a little bit higher caliber than the tier they have been shopping on for coaches.
John Hines is one of the coaches of all time, and it's tough. Like, you know, you don't want to rag on somebody just for the sake of it, but like, you get so many tries at it, and you know the saying that when someone shows you who they are, you know, let them. Yeah. Like, this is who John Hines is as a coach, and I understand that Minnesota's roster isn't as good as Vegas's is, and there's certain factors that go into it, but at a certain point, you know, eventually you have to win a series, and Minnesota is they were a good team this year. There was issues along the way, sure, but Minnesota had the opportunity to win that series. Vegas kind of gave it to them a little bit. Like, Vegas didn't play super well throughout the course of every minute of that game, and Minnesota, I mean, Matt Boldy is going to be a star. Minnesota, or if he's not already, like, Brock Faber's obviously another, you know, exceptional talent. Like, Minnesota has those potential game changers, and so the challenge now for Minnesota is, okay, I think they need a new head coach. I think they need to build around these guys and really start to go for it. They're going to need a new goalie because Fleury's retiring. You know, maybe honestly, like, a tandem of Gustafsson and Jake Allen would do really well for them. Not only, you know, you can kind of insert Jake Allen and, you know, immediately be an upgrade in the backup goalie spot, but also just give Gustafsson more rest. Don't play him every single night, like that Minnesota likes to do, because they don't trust their backup goalie. Which, why would you have a backup goalie you don't trust? But that's neither here nor there. But, like, you know, if they look at what they've done this season and where they could go, given the trajectory of this roster, I think there is a path towards, you know, improving and even being a potential conference, you know, threat if they make those swings that Washington did. If they do something that the Rangers did, where it's like, okay, well, maybe, you know, we'll trade one player, or like change the coach for somebody that, you know, it looks the same but has a mustache, like, you know, just something like that, where it's 3 guys, it's 3 kids in a trench coat, like, then that won't do anything. But if they learn from other teams, and, you know, like Washington or you know, whatever, and realize, okay, well, we can make something happen here, but things have, you know, certain things have had to change, I can see it. I can definitely see it.
That's all 8 playoff series. That'll do it for this week's edition of Liberty Blue. Everyone enjoy the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. We will talk to you guys real soon. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or over on YouTube. We will see you guys soon. And Jordan Binnington sucks.
Later.